Good afternoon. This is Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs with WorldOregon. I'm going to start doing my intro as people come in from the waiting room. I do like to reward people that show up on time and not make people wait too long. Welcome to Snowpocalypse 2023. We are able to offer this wonderful program through the magic of technology, and I'm glad today to have with us David Wrathall from OSU. Before I get to his intro, I want to talk a little bit about some things that are coming up for us here at WorldOregon. Some things to put on your radar. April 28th is Bridging Together. It's our annual yearly fundraiser. Put that date in your mind. We will be sending out some more information. You may have gotten a postcard in the mail about it. Bridging Together is what we used to call World Quest. It is the same idea. It is the same philosophy, and we welcome you to join us April 28th as we bridge together to support the work that we do here at WorldOregon. Other things coming up, we have a fortuitous theme here for our International Visitor Program. We are hosting visitors from 16 different African countries who are looking at climate change issues. We will have 18 visitors, 5 liaisons, English and French speaking here in town, March 11th or 12th, who are looking for dinner hosting. So if you would like to meet folks from around the globe and open up your home and be an ambassador for Oregon, we would welcome that. You can find out more information at worldoregon.org. This is part of our World Dinners series, where we connect local folks with people visiting from every corner of the globe. And next week, picking up on the tails of this week's program, we are hosting a climate refugee role play being led by Deb Delman, WorldOregon's Youth Leadership Manager. It is an incredible opportunity to take what you learn about today and get up off your feet and step into the shoes of people from around the world who are actually being affected directly, immediately, and urgently by issues around climate migration. And that's going to be Wednesday, March 1st at noon at Portland State. You can find out more information about this at worldoregon.org. And I hope you can join us. We're going to have an intergenerational group of grad students from PSU, students from local schools, hopefully some of our Great Decision attendees. And it is a really great way to engage both empathy and geopolitics in a very fun and interactive way. So check that out at worldoregon.org. And that brings me back to today's program. As per usual, we will have our speakers speak for about 30-40 minutes. I will jump back in at the end of that for Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen or the top, wherever it is on your screen. And we will try and get your questions answered. Very happy today to have with us Dr. David Wrathall. He's an associate professor of natural hazards at Oregon State University's College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He also coordinated the group of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change authors contributing to the cross-chapter treatment of migration and displacement and mobility. So he studies the way that climate change impacts our threatening people's livelihoods and rendering parts of the planet uninhabitable, which is absolutely germane to today's conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and it's really good to be with all of you. I'm going to share my screen here and we can get going. Yes, I'm a professor at Oregon State University, and it's correct that I did take part in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment as a lead author on the chapter Poverty, Livelihoods, and Sustainable Development. And part of my tasks were to coordinate the cross-chapter assessment of what we know about the relationship between migration and climate change. And so today I'm going to reflect some of those findings to you, and I'm going to speak to Karen Jacobson's very well-written article, and we'll discuss some issues of agreement and maybe some disagreement as we go through our lecture today. Okay, so this is just this is the IPCC, the UN. It does these climate assessments from time to time at about 7-year intervals. And so I was involved in the last one, which just was released last year, and our duties are sort of trailing to an end at this point. But this is what a group of lead authors meeting as chapter heads looks like. Again, I mentioned the chapter I was on, dealing with poverty and livelihoods, sustainable development, the issues of the most extreme climate change impacts to the most vulnerable people. So we were known colloquially as the climate justice chapter, just to give you a sense of what I do and what I think about. And so within the climate change community, we have some really big questions about the extent to which climate change is going to affect the habitability, the essential habitability of planet Earth. And how many people will it affect? Where will those people go? When will this happen? And one of the key questions here, and I think this is really speaks to some of our potential uncertainties and maybe anxieties about this, is the question about how determined this already is. Is this foreordained, or do we have some choices here? And so I'm going to just give you a spoiler here that we do have a lot of choices. And it depends on the choices that we make today. So we'll get there. Okay, so an outline for today, I'm going to give you an overview of migration and climate hazards, just so that we have some common understanding of the things we're talking about. And then I'll tell you 5 things we do know about climate change first. Things that we have high confidence about. And then we'll go through 5 things that we do not know. And this is organizing our time together. Okay, so what is migration? First of all, migration is a universal strategy. It's found among every single people on Earth. It's a strategy that people use to improve livelihoods, to look after their own wealth and welfare. It's a way of reducing risk to economic changes that could happen, or environmental disruptions. And we find it almost everywhere on Earth. And so migration, first and foremost, is a normal thing. Everybody does it. Human life without migration is not normal. So when we think about migration in response to climate change, this is a very normal, expected sort of outcome. Okay, so when we talk about climate change, in its bare essence, climate change is warming, right? We're emitting these greenhouse gas emissions. What they're doing is trapping radiation, re-reflecting this radiation into our climate system, right? So at its very basis, climate change is warming, and that warming has an impact on snow, glaciers, and ice. It's melting. It's making our planet warmer, and it's melting ice. It's also changing the water cycle. The water is this strange little molecule, right? It sort of evaporates and then condenses in the temperature ranges that we find very common on Earth. So it's the climate change, this warming is affecting our water cycle. And then all the extra CO2 in our environment is also leading to chemical changes in our oceans. So we think about ocean acidification specifically. But so then when we step from climate change into the hazards, we're thinking about things like heat extremes, sea level rise, sea level extremes, water scarcity and flooding, droughts, extreme weather, ocean acidification. So all of these climate hazards are present with us here in the Pacific Northwest. These are all things that we're going to be living with as the decades progress into the 21st century. This will be a part of our reality. This will shape the way we live. And so what the way that this shapes the way we live is in terms of climate change impacts, the bad things, the adverse consequences, the negative outcomes that are associated with these climate hazards. So with heat extremes, we can expect death, the loss of human life. Sea level rise and extremes can result in property losses. Water scarcity and flooding can result in agricultural losses, losses in forestry, losses in ranching. Droughts, we're expecting some additional wildfire risk associated with a change in decreases in precipitation. And the timing of precipitation is going to change in the Pacific Northwest, which is going to result in some flooding probably if we don't manage our water well. And then, ocean acidification is really can drive and this collapses maybe hyperbole, but changes in fisheries. So these are all impacts that we can expect in the Pacific Northwest. So any of these impacts, any of these hazards and impacts can alter our mobility habits, the way that we decide to move and where we live on planet Earth. So if we think about risk here, risk is a combination of climatic change and non-climatic factors that come together to produce a certain level of risk that we all live with. So then along comes a climate hazard and we have to respond to it. So normally what happens is we respond to a climate hazard by adapting in situ. That's a technical word that means in place. So we're adapting to some sort of climate hazard that comes along. So flooding, we build flood embankments, and we think about water management strategies that can attenuate, that can lessen, mitigate the potential impacts of flooding. And then that's how we successfully adapt in place, and risk decreases over time. But migration can happen when the types of adaptation, the strategies that we would use to adapt in situ are insufficient. And so mobility can result at a certain tolerance threshold. At a certain point, we can determine we can no longer bear living in this place, or we need to engage in mobility to get resources that will enable us to live in this place. And so this whole set of complicated mobility outcomes can result at a specific threshold when we can no longer adjust to climate hazards in place. So we're going to break this down, don't worry. Okay, so there are specific climate hazards that we know are highly associated with mobility outcomes. So in the IPCC, we determined that the most commonly associated hazard with displacement are tropical cyclones and flooding. So where you see cyclones, hurricanes, tropical hurricanes, and the flooding outcomes. So this is the eastern seaboard of the United States, the Caribbean, the whole Caribbean coast of Mexico and Central America. We can expect migration outcomes from those sorts of hazards. So I'm just going to show you really quick some communities where I have worked for a very long time. The north coast of Honduras. What you're looking at is two images that from 2004 and 2006, before and after a tropical cyclone that where the flooding burst through this community. What you're looking at, this area of land that's lost in that red circle, was the center. There were houses and schools and churches and municipal buildings that were lost in this flooding event. And I'm going to show you right now what that looks like. So let's see, I'm going to turn down the volume a little bit so I can narrate this. This is a community on the north coast. It's called Bataya. And these are Garifuna people that live in this community. And so what you're hearing in the background will be a mix between Spanish and Garifuna. So what you're seeing is there had been this tropical cyclone and all the water was coming down from the mountains, and in the space of a single afternoon, the flood that fell in that hurricane, the water that fell was just surging through the watershed. And in the space of just 3 or 4 hours, that water rushed down and punched through the community. So at first it was just a static flood. It was like standing water. But then as the water found an opening to the ocean, it started to gather some momentum, and the current started carrying material with it. The sandy, the sandy soil of this community and the houses that were sitting on top of it. And so at first you see this community, they're standing by and they're watching this house. They're watching this entire house taken out to sea in just the space of a couple minutes. And they're kind of watching like curiously, like, wow, this is interesting, watch this. But at a certain stage in this video, they realize, oh dear, this is serious. And this flood, the opening of this flood water is expanding, and it's going to take more than just a couple houses with it. It could take all of our houses. So then what you see is people going into their homes and they're trying to evacuate what they can in the time that they have. And so, this is a long video that I've edited down in just to a couple of minutes, but you see the process of evacuation, the fishing boats get involved. And then at the end, in just the space of a couple hours, again, the entire center of this community was destroyed. So he's going to pan from south to north in just a second. And all of that was community just a few hours later. It was houses, it was schools, it was neighborhood. It was markets, stores, and it's all gone. And so the people who lived and relied in that place are now displaced. They have no choice but to move. And so in these circumstances, we would call this displacement, involuntary displacement. And so this occurs when adaptive alternatives are exhausted or not viable. And so we use this term when we think about high levels of exposure and vulnerability to climate hazards. So that's a vivid illustration. So, cyclones are one thing, hurricanes, but flooding can also happen in broad daylight. So what you're looking at here is an example of sunny day flooding in Florida associated with a sea level extreme. So as the sea level rises, we're going to expect more and more of this. So when sea level rise and tropical cyclones come together, wow, we're talking about real trouble. So this is a map that was put together by a colleague of mine, Peter Clark. He was also a lead author in the IPCC, that shows different countries and areas of different countries where more than 50 million people are currently living, but will be underwater as the 21st century progresses. And so each of those yellow dots is a city of more than 10 million people that will be underwater as the sea level rises. So this is not insignificant amounts of people we're talking about that will have to become mobile in the century ahead. Okay, so that's the first thing, right? Let's see. Okay, so we're into the things that we know about climate change. That's the first thing. We know that there are certain hazards that matter. The second thing we know is that outcomes are better when migrants have agency about the decision to migrate. So agency is choice. When you can choose the basic dimensions of your migration decision, where to migrate, when to migrate, how to migrate, with whom you're going to migrate, under which circumstances you can migrate. So this is a really complicated figure. Please don't try to understand it, but this it's meant to put on the table as a famous figure for those of us who work on this issue. It's meant to bring together all the important factors that would come to this decision. And so when we have, and what we know is at this decision point, when we have agency, it's going to work out better. Okay, so there's you're looking at a graph that shows the sensitivity of migration to hazards and the level of poverty. So if you have a whole bunch of different people that live in different levels of poverty, that there is this sort of curved shape response, the sensitivity to the climate hazard across this spectrum of poverty. What I mean is that people with low poverty are less likely to migrate, and people with high poverty are less likely to migrate. And there's this sort of in-between group that is much more likely to migrate. So for some people, migration, if they would take the decision at all, would only improve their situation. So this is low poverty people. But if you might encounter people who are further along the poverty spectrum, for whom migration, they're not gonna, they can use it to survive, but it's not going to help them flourish. So, and as you increase that level of poverty, then migration will actually erode your ability to cope with environmental change or just sort of things in general. It'll erode your wealth. And then you have people who are so poor that migration is not an option, and we call these trapped populations. These are chronically food insecure people who may not own land, renters or landless people, female-headed households. And so we see this again and again in the literature. This is an example of a project that was that we did at United Nations University. Okay, so the idea here is that displacement or low agency migration, that red category of migration, when people do not have a choice to migrate but are forced to, they're displaced. This is associated with poor outcomes in terms of health, well-being, socioeconomic security, and it returns fewer benefits to the people who would be receiving those migrants. So we really want to avoid displacement if we can. It doesn't help anybody. Okay, third thing that we do know is that migration, especially displacement, is expensive. If any of you have ever migrated, you know what it involves. It's expensive, right? Every time you move somewhere, you have to pay for new things. You have to figure out where the grocery store is. You have to figure out how the bus system works. You don't have any friends. You need to develop a new social network. You have to figure out how your job works. You have to buy furniture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Migration is expensive. And so people cannot always absorb the cost. So again, I want to take you back to this community, and I want to show you this really, really interesting figure that illustrates how expensive migration is. And so if it's expensive, not everybody will do it. Okay, so what you're looking at is 3 columns of the population of this community around these different hurricanes that hit. So there's a population in 1997, the population in 2001, the population in 2009. And in between, there were these big hurricanes that hit, Hurricane Mitch and then Tropical Depression Gamma, which hit. And so in the first hurricane, we know that only a maximum of about 600 people were displaced. And yet we saw about 2,800 additional people migrate after that event. And then along comes a second cyclone, and there were a lot more people, there were a lot more houses that were destroyed. And yet there was very, very little change in the number of people who moved. And so to really understand that, let's take this second column, the 2001 column, we're going to turn it into a population pyramid, which breaks the population down in terms of male and female. This is kind of a coarse way of breaking this. This is what demographers have historically done. And then we look at it in terms of ages. And so male on the left, female on the right, and then we go from 0 to 94 years old. And this is what we call a population pyramid. And so this is the population after this first giant hurricane hit. So I'm going to superimpose the population pyramid of another community that was exactly like this one, Santa Rosa de Aguan, that didn't get hit by a hurricane. And so just to emphasize the differences, this is, the gray one in the background is what the population might have looked like. And the one that you see in red and blue is what is the population that was flooded out. So we can see who migrated more or less. And what we saw, the people who didn't migrate were children below the age of 15 and elderly people. And who did migrate were people of working age. This is who's missing in the population. And this reflects the thing I'm trying to tell you here. Migration is expensive. And so not everybody does it. And the people you would expect to do it are the working age folks who can go and migrate and earn some money, who can absorb the costs. Because migration is expensive, people don't like to move very far if they can avoid it. So in the case of climate change and migration, people almost always stick to the same region where this climate change impact is happening. They'll move to a nearby city. People rarely move to another country. And so we know that most climate change related migration and displacement happens within countries because it's expensive. Okay, number 4, we know that that migration, lots of different kinds of migration can happen because of climate hazards, and it all depends on the hazard and the type of impact. And so a drought can cause one type of migration. A flood can cause one type of migration. Sea level rise is likely to cause another type of migration. And these can all happen all at the same time. And it makes it very, very complicated. But the idea here is that these hazards can cause migration to increase or decrease or flow in new directions. And we have very high confidence that this is the case. Okay, so just a quiz to you. If you were to look at these 2 households, you've got a woman standing in front of a flood, a family whose house was destroyed in a catastrophic flood, and you've got a farmer who's lost 3 years of crops in a row to drought. Who's more likely to migrate permanently? And so I have no way of engaging you on this. I don't know what you're going to answer, but I can tell you what my students commonly answer, and it's that they say it's the flooded house. And the truth is, the actual fact is that it's the farmer who's more likely to migrate. And so when we think about a type of migration that can emerge, permanent migration, it's really almost always tied to livelihoods. Permanent migration is likely to result from long-term changes in the climate, and it's specifically likely to result when those long-term changes have an impact on livelihoods. So livelihoods are a very, very important part of the migration story. If you can't earn a living in a place, if you can't earn money, if you can't grow food, if you can't feed a family in a place, then you can't live in a place. And so commonly the people who are most likely to move are people who are looking for jobs somewhere else. So you're a farmer, you can't work, you can't farm anymore. You're going to move to the city to be a construction worker, or you're going to move to the city to be a taxi driver. And that's something we see almost everywhere in the world. Okay, so to drive this point home, I'm going to show you this study. So, we all carry these mobile phones with us, right? We're carrying mobile phones in our pocket. And with these, we're actually leaving enormous trails of data with us. And so in Bangladesh, what you're looking at is southern Bangladesh, where we used mobile phone data on people's mobility patterns to study how people moved in response to a hurricane that struck southern Bangladesh. So this is one of the most vulnerable places on Earth. And so what happened, there's all of those tracks that are they're headed towards Chittagong. It looked like this cyclone was going to hit Chittagong. And all the warnings were like, careful Chittagong, this cyclone is coming. But at the last minute, it veered to the north and went into Barishal, this area, very, very vulnerable area. So this is what it looks like. Bangladesh is extremely vulnerable. It's a country about half the population of the United States in an area about the size of Wisconsin, with the topography of something like Louisiana. So it's a very, very vulnerable location, very high population density, high poverty. And so if you think about climate change and migration, you're inevitably going to have to think about Bangladesh. Okay, so the cyclone hits this area, and this is what you're looking at here is just 24 hours of mobile phone data from this area. And so everywhere where you see a little yellow line, that's somebody who made a call and it connected to one tower, and then they moved to another location and made a call and connected to another tower. So this is just to give you a sense. In 24 hours, there are a lot of people moving around. And so we used this very, very rich information on human mobility to think about how people move around a cyclone. And this is what we found. So I'm just going to summarize. This is a really interesting finding. So Chittagong is that area in the lower of the yellow kind of network. It's the yellow left, sorry, the lower left, that's Chittagong. One of the things we found is that in the 6 weeks after this cyclone, we saw an enormous number of SIM cards, mobile phones arriving in the city compared to a baseline of the hurricane, the date the hurricane hit. And so at first, what we thought was that, oh my goodness, 65,000 additional phones, something like 180,000 people arriving in Chittagong after this cyclone event. But when we compared the mobile phone records of this during the year of the cyclone to the previous year when there was no cyclone, we saw exactly the same thing. And what we determined was that the cyclone did not cause any migration whatsoever, that this was just part of seasonal migration that always happens. And so, at first this finding looked compelling, but what we found is that a short-term climate shock, a short-term climate hazard has virtually no impact on human mobility. Okay, I hope you're with me. We're gonna take a deep breath and we're gonna continue on. The fifth thing that we know for sure about migration and climate change is that people often migrate towards risk, making future repeated migration necessary. This is a really strange phenomenon. Why do people move towards risk? So what you're looking at here is a community that had been flooded. It's a riverside community right on the bank of this big river that changes very much seasonally. There's seasonal variations in this river. And there had been a serious flood the year before, and some of the people who'd been displaced in that flood relocated to this, what you see here is interviewee 54, inside of the embankment, a very vulnerable place, no protection at all from any future flooding. So why would someone choose to live there? The reason why is because they'd been displaced, they lost wealth, they lost income, they lost resources, and they didn't have the resources available to obtain a safer location. So, the process of displacement and migration is impoverishing. And in that time, the safe places, destinations just aren't available to people. So that means that people will migrate towards risk. And so this, I'm just showing you a super laser focused case study, but we see this at very large scales as well. So again, back to Bangladesh, I want to tell you about this model that we built about sea level rise scenarios for the coming century ahead. Basically, what we did is it's called an agent-based model of migration. So this is, it's like, imagine a video game of migrants, right? That we programmed this video game of Bangladesh for the century ahead to the year 2100. And we programmed all of the people in Bangladesh as making migration decisions. And this was calibrated on real data. So these little agents that we built were perfect replicate. They were replicated migration just as we see it in real life. And so we programmed, this is what migration looks like normally. And this is what if we simulated a complete shock to livelihoods on the coast. And so then what we did is we programmed these migrants to behave in response to flooding like they would for expected flooding in the century ahead. And we ran this thousands of times. We simulated migration over thousands of different potential climate scenarios. And this is what we found, this very, very counterintuitive finding. So don't look at those figures. They're not going to mean too much, and we don't have time to go into it. But what we found is that as we increased sea level rise and flooding on the coast, that people actually migrated towards the coast. Totally counterintuitive. You have a whole bunch of migration experts that are involved in this research, and we get this finding, and we're like, what? How can this possibly be? And the explanation is actually pretty simple. That the reason for this, people migrating towards the coast, is that where are people migrating? They're migrating towards cities. And where are the cities? The cities are on the coast. So as people lose jobs in agriculture and rural areas, they migrate towards cities. And we build cities on the coast for a whole bunch of historical reasons. And that's why. And so despite the flooding risk, we found that people were more likely to migrate towards the coast. Okay, so we've gone through these things that we do know. Now here we are at the things we don't, and we're going to fly through this, okay? Because we're getting short on time. So take a breath. Here we go. How many people will migrate because of climate change? And I love this. This is the most common question I get as an expert on climate change and migration. People are always asking how many people are going to migrate. So, the first guesses were pretty low, pretty conservative, 50 million. This comes from 1985. Il-Hinawi, and this was cited for a long time. 50 million people will migrate because of climate change. This is totally conservative. It's going to be a lot more than that. In the 90s, that estimate goes up. The most common estimate for a while was around 200 million. This is Norman Myers was kind of famous for this estimate. The Stern Review was a famous report on climate change in the mid-2000s. Also picked this up, 200 million. And then the numbers just they float around 200 million. It goes up to 250 for a while. Recently, Elon Musk weighed in on this and estimated 2 billion people by 2100, which I thought was hilarious. The fact is, we don't know. So one of my colleagues, Francois Germain, wrote this really important paper that said, stop guessing, people, because we just don't know. The truth is, the number of people that migrate because of climate change depends on how bad climate change is. So this is what you're looking at, is a map of the southeastern United States, the Gulf Coast, Florida, the Caribbean, there's Cuba and the Gulf of Mexico, the Yucatan, and down into Central America. So this is the land that would be lost with 1 meter of inundation. And so you can imagine that this level of inundation would result in a certain level of migration, and as those meters go up and up and up and up, there would be a corresponding change in the number of migrants who would end up having to, seek another place to live. So it turns out that the number of people impacted by just sea level, if we're going to take sea level rise as a hazard and take that one alone, it totally depends on the levels of emissions that we continue to, put into our atmosphere in the century ahead. So this, if you've worked on climate change issues for a long time, this is meant to represent the different emission scenarios. So this RCP 2.6 down the blue line, this is if we somehow manage to beat all expectations and reduce our emissions miraculously. This will be RCP 2.6. And then on the other side, this is what we call the business as usual emission scenario, RCP 8.5. That's if we continue as we are. And so what we can see is that under RCP 2.6, even if we miraculously reduce our emissions, there will still be about 10.4 million people exposed to sea level rise. And if you compare that to a century in which we don't even attempt to reduce our emissions, we get about 26.3 million. So huge differences just from our emissions, okay? So the answer to the question, how many people will migrate, is it depends on how fast we reduce our emissions. The second question that I get is, where will migrants go? And so we really don't know. And obviously it depends, it's a very complex set of interactions, but we have some tools for predicting. So what you're looking at here is a map that some of my students made on projections of migrants from sea level rise from Norfolk, Virginia, based on 1.6 meters of sea level rise by the year 2100. So these are all people who would have to move somewhere. And this is a prediction of where they might go. And what we see from this is that there is a certain number of people, even just from Norfolk, Virginia, that would go to the Pacific Northwest. So some of them are going to come here. And so here you're looking at Sacramento, California, San Francisco Bay Area. And we also see a significant number of people. So the answer is they go everywhere. Miami's sea level rise problem is also Atlanta's problem, is also Nashville's problem, is also Portland, Oregon's problem. The short answer to that is migrants go everywhere. Okay, so who will need to migrate but will be unable? I just want to run through this very quickly. There is this increasing concern for what we call trapped populations, people who are unable to migrate even though they really need to. And so what you're looking at is a map of annual air surface temperature in the year 2040. So this is just 20 years from now. The mean surface temperature, the hottest places on Earth. And what we see is this concentration in sub-Saharan Africa. And then those little dots that you see are refugee camps. So these are people who do not have a choice about where they can move. These encamped populations really have pretty severe restrictions sometimes on their ability to move. So they're kind of stuck in these locations. So if we zoom into these areas, we see the highest concentrations of refugee camps in the world are in the places that are going to be the hottest. These are people who can't move, but really need to. And so this is becoming, this is the extreme case, right? Refugee camps, but this is really an issue. Generally, people who, we can think about elderly populations who really need to move, but away from coastlines, perhaps, like Florida, this aging population on the coastline, as things get increasingly risky, but these populations are really less able to move than other populations. Okay, so this is a key question. Are future outcomes already determined, or do we have some choices about how things are going to turn out? Or is this just going to happen? Or is this going to play out, or do we have some choice here? So one of the things that we know, these experts like me who work on this thing, is that migration around climate hazards is strongly influenced, very strongly influenced by the background stuff that's happening in our societies, economic, social, political, and demographic processes, the things that are in the background. So that's why in one context, you can see a drought and see very, very little migration. And then in another context, you see a drought and lots of people are migrating. So there's nothing that's determined. What determines everything is our background, And so specifically where the area that we have choices are the policies and the plans that we can make for human migration. So I'm going to just kind of spell out to you, this is a paper that we wrote, some of us that showed up in Nature Climate Change. This is this big journal. And the key argument that we're making is that policies and planning decisions that we make determine almost every aspect of migration around sea level rise. And so just to walk you through this really quickly, there's a community, there's a hypothetical community at sea level, and the exposure to sea level goes up through time until, certain parts of this community are totally overwhelmed by sea level rise. And so in this populated area, this is a kind of hypothetical map you're seeing. These are all of the sorts of migration dynamics that we could expect to occur simultaneously, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. All the different types of migration we could see all at the same time. And so what we wanted to do in this paper is just outline all of the ways in which policies and planning decisions determine outcomes for all of these things. And I'll just show you two types. This is just because it's an involved paper, but you can understand this. So urbanization is one type of migration, is a response to one type of migration, people moving to the city. So that's one type of migration that we are very concerned about. And another type that I just talked about, mobility traps, people who get stuck, who are unable or unwilling to move. That's another type of mobility that we're really concerned about. These are totally determined by the choices that we make, the decisions, policies, and planning decisions. And so I'm going to flash this up. It's going to be overwhelming. You won't be able to take it in, but these are all the types of policy alternatives that would affect each one of these migration dynamics. Okay, so the bottom line here, and this is the key message from this, is that the more agency migrants have, the better the benefits of migration to migrants themselves and to the people who receive them, the hosts of migrants. And so when we can plan on migration, we can build agency for migrants so that they can make choices about where they want to migrate and how they want to get there. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in a sec. This is the last thing, and then we're gonna end. Okay, so I really liked how Karen Jacobson's paper gets into this. This is important. There are huge discrepancies between the realities of migration and the discourses. The discourses are the ways that we talk about it, and the ways that we talk about it are biased. They're based on our preconceptions, our prejudices, okay? This is so important. You think that it's one way, but it's actually not, that you and I and all of us are actually biased and prejudiced against migrants. So migrants themselves are. I want to, this is one of the first statements in 1995, Atiq Rahman, he's a friend and a colleague. He was the delegate at for Bangladesh at the first climate change convention of the UN. We call this the Conference of Parties at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And he said from the podium to all of the other negotiators, he threatened them. He said, if climate change makes our country uninhabitable, we'll march with our wet feet into your living rooms. This sort of alarmist idea that migrants are coming for us. We're gonna march right into your living room. And so, Karen mentioned the paper by our friend Giovanni Bettini, Climate Barbarians at the Gates. This is something that you should fear. This is something that you should be scared of. But, we talk about floods of people, flows of population, waves of migration, an influx, a surge of asylum seekers. We think about these human beings in very dehumanizing ways, as water flows of people. And this is just the common way of speaking about migrants. And this is a reflection of our biases and our prejudices. It turns out that migrants are not people to be afraid of, that by and large, they're more law-abiding and they contribute more to a host society than the host population themselves. They're more likely to follow laws. Their children are more likely to earn higher wages. They're more likely to give culturally and economically to a community. Migrants are the best and the brightest. And so we want to do things to welcome them. And so I could talk for ages about that. And I say that not as that's not my opinion. I say that as somebody who is a scholar on these issues, who's weighed all of the evidence on it. So the take-home messages I'd like to leave you with: are that people will migrate to climate change, but that is normal and that's fine. We should anticipate this and we should expect them. So migration is very complex, but it's responsive to the decisions we make and we can plan for it. And when we plan for it, we can improve agency of migrants so that there are more potential win-win benefits for migrants themselves and for the host communities. And so that's the sort of message I'd like to end on. And I'll just stop talking there and take a few questions.
Great, David. Thank you so much. This is the disembodied voice of Tim DeRoche, your director of programs here at WorldOregon. Fantastic presentation. I was texting with some of my coworkers saying you offer such an accessible on-ramp to the science and the research going on here. And I just, before we get into the questions, want to say thank you. It is a big issue. It's an issue that we have looked at over and over again at WorldOregon. And I think one of the challenges is some kinds of issues like disaster preparedness topics often shut us down. Paul Slovic down at the University of Oregon has written a lot on psychic numbing. And we so often think of these issues as happening in, quote unquote, other places, where they have hurricanes or in the global south. And it's hard to wrap our heads around this. So I'm curious, you hinted at this a little bit. What kind of modeling is going on for this happening here in our own backyard? And to throw a question in from Vim Vivel, who's in the audience, is it correct to say that given the multiple factors affecting household migration, that for the Pacific Northwest, in and out migration due to climate change will be quite modest?
Well, we don't exactly know. We know, so I can say what we know already about migration in the Pacific Northwest, and this has yet to be studied systematically in a sort of in a way that I would be that I could speak about more than anecdotally. I think this is let's do some research on this. Yes, I think I'm inviting it. But what we do know is that there are currently in the state of Oregon thousands of people who have become migrants as a result of wildfires in recent years. And so people who've been displaced and who've become mobile, who are migrating within our state and beyond as a result of hazards we've already seen and we can definitely expect in the years ahead. As far as people coming migrating to the Pacific Northwest because of concern about climate hazards elsewhere, that's absolutely anecdotally the case. So, I have a little file that I'm keeping of people that I hear of who've migrated here because of potential climate hazards elsewhere. And I think we need to study that. But, I talk to people all the time who've migrated from Florida, from South Carolina, from, the mid-Atlantic coastal regions for concern about cyclones, hurricanes, and sea level rise. But this is definitely something, please, I think to the person who asked the question, let's do some research on that. And then I would just say in the Pacific Northwest, we've got a very important, one of the struggles of our time related to poverty and inequality within our country is the issue of our unhoused population. This is really important. We really need to get our heads around this. And so I have a student here who just graduated who is looking on the nexus between climate change hazards here and the unhoused population. And one of the things that we found that there is a relationship and that we can expect climate change to be an amplifier of this problem that's pretty persistent, that we really need to get our heads around. So part of the solution to climate change is resolving this problem of the people who are, the most marginalized in our society, those who are unhoused, homeless. So there are some important connections here.
So climate denial has experienced quite a crescendo from a fairly loud and vocal minority, folks, pitting weather versus climate. And some of these people are stewarding policy and law at this point. What are some talking points for engaging with deniers and skeptics who would fixate on things like weather and climate?
Well, I teach a course on this, and I've got 2 lectures, one on climate denialism and another on climate communication, where I talk about why it is that people deny climate change and how it is you would speak to people who deny climate change. And it really is, we know about misinformation. This is like the story of the last few years, right? It turns out that humans are totally gullible. We're super gullible. Oh my gosh, it's a problem. And this is going to be a problem for the decades ahead. And those of us who've been working on climate change saw this coming before the rest of you, because we've experienced climate denialism, which is a type of misinformation that is very strategic, that has been, it really has its roots in the fossil fuel industry. And there have been books written on this, and I could come to my class and I could give you the whole lecture on it. But one of the important thing, one of the good news here is that this is, it really is a problem of the United States, and it's a political problem within the United States. And so it's not all people, it really is, a certain group of, it's a problem of the Republican Party, to be totally honest, in the United States. And it's due to our specific, the way that we allow lobbying, right? The influence of companies on our political process. And so, the fossil fuel industry is very large in the United States, and it has a lot of political influence. And the message has been very clear from the fossil fuel industry that they really don't want to, they're trying to undermine the science, and they have been for decades. But this is coming apart with a younger generation. So across the political spectrum, the good news is that young people are on board for climate change. If you look at Generation Z and millennials, there's hardly any difference across the political spectrum in terms of their concern for climate change. And so this is a figment of a specific type of politics and a specific segment of the demographic, slice of our demography that it's going to have to resolve over time. You can only deny reality for so long before it, comes back and hits you in the face.
Well, you hinted at the youth climate movement. And I was going to ask you about that. I think there's no denying that the youth climate movement has had tremendous momentum. Are you seeing that reflected in the types of students who are going into this field? And are you hopeful about what they're bringing to the table?
Oh yeah, no, I'm young people. I work with young people all the time, and I'm really, the young people have entered this very challenging world. We've given them a really rough puzzle to fix, right? Lots and lots of problems of lots of different types, all at the same time. We're basically handing this world to them and we're saying, fix it, and so they've got some challenges, and I think they're up to it. I spend a lot of time with young people, and I believe that, I see so much energy and motivation on these things. That you talked about this burnout problem, and we call it apocalypse fatigue, and this is the real risk here, that we just decide it's overwhelming, it's too much, and we check out. But there are lots of tools we have for living good lives and living well. And when we can live well, and we can, sort of accept the difficulties of these things, then there's a lot more we can do. And I'm seeing this among the students I work with, making choices like to just put down our phones and live in the world and make choices that are sustainable. It's like there's a sort of movement of people who are doing that, and it brings me a lot of hope.
Thank you. Can you talk about the legal status of climate refugees based in the 1951 United Nations Convention on Refugees, and are climate refugees recognized legally today?
So I have trouble with this term climate refugee because of the specific need to protect actual refugees. Refugees are people who are driven from their home country, stateless people, by persecution of others. They're driven out for reasons of ethnicity, or for language, or for religion, or for political beliefs. And they experience danger to life and limb because of who they are, and they need to seek refuge in another country that is not their own. And refugee is a legal status that we give to them because of the specific threat. And so I have trouble with the word climate refugee, but we can think of climate migrants very, very clearly. This is, people who are displaced because of climate change, and it is the overwhelming reason for their predicament. We think about the small island developing states like Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Maldives. These are places that face risk of total annihilation of their homeland, of their entire countries, because of climate sea level rise in the coming century. And so, you know, what legal status do these people hold? And we're trying to figure this out. But yeah, it's a long answer to that question. I don't know if I can adequately answer it. But there are the frameworks that I think are most hopeful are regional frameworks, where different countries that live in the same region are starting to imagine a social contract in which one country recognizes the rights of the citizens of another country and offers entitlements to those people. And so, you know, the neighboring countries of Tuvalu and I'm forgetting who it is that has offered basic protections like guarantees to healthcare, guarantees to education, ability to vote in an election, to their neighbors who might have to move because of climate change. And I think those sort of portable entitlements and flexibility in the social contract is what we really, really need, not just in places like the Pacific, the South Pacific, but really globally. We need to start thinking about this as migration becomes, we've got a century of migration ahead. We have to be ready for it.
Well, I want to be mindful of the time because I know you have a class after this. And I mean, boy, howdy, we could talk about this all day. What would be wonderful is if you could share with me your PowerPoint. I would imagine some folks will want to follow up on it. Really rich information. I want to remind everyone, we've just put in the chat a link to join the climate role play next week that Deb Delman, our youth leadership manager, is going to be leading at PSU. I encourage all of you to look at that and look at the materials on the Zen Education Project site. It's worthwhile noting that this project was one of the first ones designed by high school students that Zen Education Project is using. And I believe Deb told me that over 1,000 people have been touched or affected by this fantastic work that all generated out of wonderful youth in our own backyard. David, thanks so much for just a really, really great conversation. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope everyone is staying warm and safe and cozy, and hopefully we'll see all of you next week in person.
Thanks so much. I'll see you later.